Hello there, and welcome. You've found yourself here perhaps, searching for a moment of calm. Maybe you're looking to drift off gently into sleep, or maybe you're simply curious. Either way, you're in the right place. Tonight, we'll take a quiet walk through cloisters thick with incense and candlelight. A world of silence, of rules, of repetition. A world far from our own, and yet deeply human. We're stepping inside the cold stone walls of the medieval monastery. Monks are often imagined as peaceful figures, copying texts, praying at dawn, living simple, contemplative lives. And in some ways, that's true. But there's another story, a quieter, harsher truth beneath the chants and robes. Life behind those monastery walls was a daily rhythm of discomfort, strict obedience, and loneliness. And beyond that tangled web of politics, pressure, and power, tonight's journey will unfold in 4 soft chapters. First, we'll walk through a day in the life of a medieval monk, what they heard, what they ate, what they endured. Then, we'll meet Bede the Venerable, one of the early monastic minds who shaped the identity of a nation. After that, we'll drift into the mystery of the missing manuscripts, the lost libraries of the Middle Ages. And finally, we'll glimpse the strange moment when monks became feudal lords, wielding surprising power over everyday life. So now, take a breath, settle in, let the sounds of the present fade away, and imagine yourself beneath the heavy stone arches of an old monastery, where bells ring not for beauty, but for control. Let us begin. Imagine yourself in a stone cell no wider than your outstretched arms. The walls are damp, the air is still. Outside, it's still dark, but a bell has begun to ring. It's just before sunrise, and your day as a medieval monk is already beginning. The bell is called the matins bell, and it signals the first prayer of the day. There are many more to come. You rise in silence, no talking is allowed. Your feet touch the cold floor, and you slip into the same rough robe you've worn for years, made from coarse wool that itches against your skin. There is no private mirror, no soft light, just a flickering candle and the steady shuffle of other monks down the corridor. You join them in the chapel. The air is thick with incense. The chanting begins low, steady, repetitive. It is Latin, and though you've memorized it, you may not truly understand every word. That's not the point. The point is obedience, discipline, and silence. This is just one of the divine hours of structure of the day, built around 8 fixed times of prayer: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. The hours don't ask what you feel like doing. They tell you what you must do. After prayers, there's a moment to eat. You file into the refectory, the dining hall. Again, no speaking. Meals are taken in silence, while a single monk reads from scripture or a religious text. The food is plain, and not much of it. Beans, bread, sometimes a bit of cabbage or onion. If it's a fast day end, many days rue eat even less. The meals may lack flavor, but they are rich in rules. No meat from 4-legged animals, no second helpings, no exceptions, unless you're sick, and even then, it depends. Then come the chores. Depending on the monastery, you might be a copyist, hunched over a manuscript in the scriptorium. The ink is cold and the light dim, streaming through high, narrow windows. If you are not a scribe, you may be outside tending gardens, caring for livestock, chopping wood, or repairing tools. Some monasteries are practically self-sufficient villages. Every task, from brewing ale to weaving cloth, could be done by monks. In the fields, the work is physical. In the scriptorium, it's mental. But both share one thing: repetition. Days blending into days. The same lines of Latin, the same morning frost, the same aching knees from long hours of prayer. The rhythm of a monk's life was not defined by freedom or discovery. It was defined by surrender. You had taken vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. The world outside was left behind. Your family name, your desires, your ambitions, all surrendered. The rule dictated even your thoughts. Idle curiosity was frowned upon. Conversation was limited to necessity. Laughter, even joy, could be considered distractions. To speak without permission was a breach. To question authority, a far graver one. Imagine the silence, not the peaceful, chosen silence of a quiet morning, but a silence imposed. A silence that muffled human connection. A silence broken only by bells, chants, or footsteps. And yet, within this rigid framework, some monks did find peace. The rhythm, though relentless, gave life a shape. Time was no longer a mystery, it was measured, predictable. Some took comfort in the lack of decisions. Each moment had a purpose, even if that purpose was humility. But even humility had its dangers. Discipline could be severe. A monk who broke the rules might be made to eat apart from the others, or lie prostrate on the floor of the chapel, or fast for days. In some places, they were whipped. In others, isolated. These were not uncommon punishments. They were considered necessary corrections of the will. Imagine being chastised not for violence or theft, but for letting your thoughts wander during prayer, for speaking out of turn, for walking too briskly. As the day winds on, more prayers are recited, more labor is performed, more silence is observed. Then, at last, complet the final prayer. It is dark again now. Candles flicker in the chapel as the last chant echoes through the nave. The air feels colder than before. Your bed is simple, sometimes just straw, sometimes wood. No pillow, no blanket, unless the weather is severe. You lie down in the same clothes you wore all day. No conversation, no stories, just the same silence that greeted you in the morning, and the same bell that will wake you before the sun. This was not a weekend retreat. This was life, every day, every year, until death. But within this rigid, cloistered world, something surprising was stirring. Knowledge hidden away behind stone walls, books copied by hand, records kept, ideas quietly preserved. And in the next chapter of our journey, we'll meet one such monk-a-man who never traveled far from his monastery, but who helped shape the identity of a kingdom. Breathe deeply now, and when you're ready, we'll continue with the life of Bede the Venerable. Let's move now, gently, from the worn stone floors of the average monastery to the quiet study of one of its most renowned inhabitants. Imagine yourself once more in a monastery, but this time it is the 8th century, and the monastery is Jarrow, in the northeast of what we now call England. The sea air is brisk, and the land outside is quiet and windswept, scattered with small huts and grazing animals. Within the stone enclosure of the monastery, a young boy is settling into his lifelong home. His name is the Venerable Bede, name granted to him not in his lifetime, but after it, out of deep respect. He never traveled far from his monastery, never led an army, never wore a crown. And yet his quiet voice still echoes across centuries. Bede entered the monastery at around 7 years old, given to the care of the church, likely as part of a noble family's offering. it was not uncommon. Young children were often given to monasteries to be raised, to learn, to serve, and to be shaped by the rule of monastic life. The boy would have woken to the same bell we heard earlier. He would have eaten the same sparse meals, learned to sing the same chants. But for Bede, it was the library, the dim room of parchment scrolls and wax tablets that truly stirred his spirit. He would come to know Latin with an intimacy few ever reached. He translated Greek. He read deeply of the Church Fathers, of Roman history, of science, music, grammar, and timekeeping. He even dabbled quietly in poetry. But Bede's days were not glamorous. The library at Jarrow was humble, though impressive by the standards of its time. Books were rare, copied painstakingly by hand. The monks took shifts in the scriptorium, scratching ink across vellum under flickering candlelight. It was slow work, cold sometimes. The smell of ink and animal skin filled the room. Yet through these unassuming tasks, Bede became the foremost scholar of his age. He spent over 50 years at the monastery. He rarely left its stone walls. His days were repetitive bells, prayers, copying, teaching, and yet within that narrow space, his mind wandered across centuries. One of Bede's greatest contributions is a book titled The Ecclesiastical History of the English People. It might sound simple, just a church history, but in it, he attempted something rare, to trace the identity of a people, the English people. He gave shape to a sense of belonging that extended beyond tribes and borders. To do this, he interviewed travelers. He corresponded with monks across distant abbeys, and he trusted the rhythm of time, the slow work of piecing stories together. Bede also played a quiet role in how we tell time. He used the Anno Domini dating system, AD, the year of our Lord, helping to standardize a way of counting years that we still use today. Quietly, gently, he reorganized the calendar of the Western world. Yet Bede did not consider himself a revolutionary. He considered himself a monk. His writing is not self-aggrandizing. It is gentle, thoughtful, and reverent. Even when he describes miracles or omens, he does so with care, carefully avoiding drama. He preferred clarity, precision, and honesty. One of the most famous moments of his life is also one of the most moving and one of the quietest. At the very end of his life, Bede continued to write. He was dictating a translation of the Gospel of John into Old English, the language of the common folk. He wanted the word to reach even the simplest ears. His final day was like so many others, calm, gray, filled with the scent of wax and parchment. As his breathing slowed, he insisted on completing the translation. His young scribe noted that, as the final lines were finished, Bede whispered a prayer of thanks and then he was gone. There was no great cry, no banners, no bells, just the quiet departure of a man who had lived his entire life between the walls of a monastery and left behind a legacy of time, language, and learning. Imagine that, a man who barely stepped beyond his cloistered walls, yet who gave structure to the very way we remember the past. And so, as the candles burn low in the scriptorium of your mind, and as the smell of old parchment fades, we drift onward. Let's turn now, softly, to a mystery, not of a person, but of a vanishing. What happened to the library's monks, like Bede, helped preserve? Why are so many ancient manuscripts lost to us? What did we once have that quietly disappeared? There's a kind of quiet sadness to an empty library, the soft weight of silence, where once there was the gentle rustle of pages, the cool air thick with the ghosts of words now gone. And so, now, we move into that quiet, into a space filled not with shelves, but with absence. Imagine yourself walking through an old monastic library. The room is stone-walled and shadowed, with light falling in from narrow windows high above. Dust floats lazily in the air. You pass long wooden tables, worn from centuries of elbows and ink stains. The smell is distinctive old vellum, beeswax, maybe a touch of mold. You run your hand gently across the cracked spine of a leather-bound volume and realize how few of them remain, because once there were thousands more, and now they are gone. This is not a sudden mystery, no single fire or grand catastrophe, no bold moment of theft or drama. No, the story of the missing manuscripts is, like so many things in history, a story of slow unraveling, of care, followed by neglect. Let us begin in the centuries just before and after Bede. Throughout the early Middle Ages, monasteries were the safe houses of books. The Roman Empire had fallen, and with it, many of its grand urban libraries crumbled. But monks, isolated in their stone enclaves, continued to copy texts, not just religious works, either. They preserved fragments of Aristotle, bits of Cicero, Galen, Pliny, Virgil. They copied what they could find, what they could read, what they believed was worth saving. A manuscript could take a year or more to copy by hand. The materials were expensive: vellum from calves, ink from oak galls, pens carved from goose feathers. To make a book was to invest months of time and the labor of several monks. They weren't just writing, they were creating objects of devotion. And yet, despite this devotion, we estimate that over 90% of all ancient manuscripts have been lost. So, what happened? Let's walk slowly through some of the causes, softly, like dust settling on a forgotten shelf. Neglect was a quiet enemy. As languages changed, Latin texts became harder to read. A new monk might open a book and find it baffling, irrelevant, or even dangerous. The teachings of ancient Greek philosophers didn't always fit neatly with church doctrine. So, the book was set aside, left untouched. Then came dampness, worms, mice, decay. A single year of roof leakage could wipe out a shelf, a few years more, and entire libraries faded into compost. War and raiding were less subtle. Monasteries, isolated and often wealthy, were frequent targets for raids, especially by Vikings in the north. A Viking had no interest in philosophy or scripture. Gold and food mattered more. And so, fires were set, walls were breached, and shelves of irreplaceable texts crumbled into ash. Liceling also played its role. This might sound strange, but in later centuries, as materials became scarce, old manuscripts were sometimes unbound and reused. The vellum could be washed faintly and written over again. These are called palimpsests. And with today's technology, we can sometimes read what lies beneath, ghost texts peeking through centuries later. But most are lost beyond recovery. Even well-meaning scholars sometimes contributed to the vanishing. In the Renaissance, a renewed interest in ancient texts led to efforts to collect and restore them, but the process was uneven. Pages were torn out, reordered, rebound. Some books were considered improved by cutting away illustrations or marginalia. Others were hidden in private collections, sealed in damp cellars, and forgotten. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII in the 16th century was especially destructive. In a single political act, hundreds of monasteries across England were dissolved. Libraries were emptied, books burned or sold for scrap. Monks who had spent their lives preserving knowledge were cast out, and the quiet rooms of the scriptorium fell still. And so, what Bede once studied, what monks once guarded, vanished, slowly, silently, not with a scream, but with a long sigh. Yet, not everything is gone. Some books survive, hidden in abbeys, buried in cathedrals, scattered in private homes. A single book carried in secret across mountains. A parchment reused in a later book's binding, preserving a few precious lines. A faded page discovered in a forgotten box in a European attic. The story of lost libraries is not just about loss. It is about rediscovery, about the quiet thrill of finding a word long buried, speaking once more. So now, as the dust settles around the long empty shelves in your mind, and the candlelight flickers across a page never read in centuries, we prepare to shift once more. We've explored the silence of daily routine. We've met the scholar who lived his whole life in devotion. We've wandered the ruins of vanished memory. Now, let us climb up the ladder of power into the upper chambers of the monastery, because not all monks lived in simplicity. Some held lands, some wielded political influence, some ruled. Let us rise, slowly, from the quiet cloisters and damp scriptoria, up the stone steps, through wooden doors iron-bound, and into the upper chambers where decisions were made. Because while many monks lived lives of silence and submission, not all within the monastery walls were equal. Some wore finer robes, some dined apart, or even better, and some held more power than lords. Let us meet them now calmly, carefully, the abbots. Picture a figure standing at the edge of a gathered village. His robe flows heavy with rich wool, trimmed at the edge, his staff capped with silver or ivory. He lifts a hand nod in blessing, but command, because in much of medieval Europe, the abbot wasn't simply a religious figure. He was a landlord, a judge, a political player. Let's drift gently through this landscape of influence. And as we do, the weight of power settles quietly around us, a soft but constant pressure. In the early Middle Ages, monasteries were granted land off in vast tracts of it by kings, nobles, or those seeking divine favor. These gifts were meant to support the monks' religious work, to provide food, wool, materials for copying manuscripts, and a place for the souls of patrons to be prayed for. But land is power, and power rarely stays idle. Imagine yourself looking at a map of monastic estates, small fields, and whole villages under the abbey's control. The peasants who lived on that land owed labor and rent to the abbey. The abbot, sitting in his vaulted office, oversaw harvests, collected taxes, and settled disputes. He was both man of God and master of men. Many abbots came from noble families. Sometimes they were appointed by kings who wanted their allies in religious seats. And while some were deeply devout, others were far more concerned with politics than prayer. One might find an abbot seated in Parliament in England, another advising the emperor in the Holy Roman Empire. Some lead armies, yes, armies marching beneath banners, stitched not with saints, but with sigils. There are records of monks taking up arms in defense of their lands, or in feuds with neighboring abbeys. This was the era of principauts, especially in the German-speaking territories. They were both ecclesiastical rulers and secular lords. Imagine the contradiction. A man who took a vow of poverty but controlled gold mines. A man who spoke of humility but lived in grand halls with tapestries and servants. In Cluny, in France, the abbots wielded influence over hundreds of dependent monasteries. The abbot of Cluny answered directly to the Pope, bypassing local bishops entirely. His signature could reshape religious policy across Europe. In England, Glastonbury Abbey was once one of the wealthiest institutions in the kingdom. Its abbot had hundreds of servants, dined with silver, and received foreign guests. He was so powerful that he rivaled local earls in influence, and so important that his fall during the dissolution under Henry VIII was marked by execution and confiscation. But power, like wealth, isolates, and even abbots safely ensconced in stone palaces faced pressures, political rivalries, shifting royal alliances, papal scrutiny. They walked a fine line between spiritual responsibility and secular ambition. One might imagine the tension. A monk kneels in the chapel at dawn, muttering prayers for the dead. An hour later, he's poring over estate ledgers. By afternoon, he's in heated debate with a visiting baron. And at night, he returns not to a cold cell but to a private chamber with a feather mattress and wine on the table. Were they hypocrites? Some, perhaps. But others saw their role as a divine trust to protect the monastery, to ensure its survival, to expand its reach for the glory of God, to serve both altar and throne. It was a balance few could keep forever. Corruption crept in like ivy through old stone. Resentments brewed both within the monastery walls and in the villages they ruled. Some monks saw their abbots as out of touch, lavish, detached. Others followed them with loyalty, believing their strength protected the monastery from a hostile world. And yet, for all their might, the abbots could not hold back time. The medieval world began to shift. New religious movements criticized wealth. Reformers called for simpler living, and the centralizing power of kings eventually saw monastic independence as a threat. The great abbots faded, their estates confiscated, their halls emptied, but their stories remain woven into the very stone of old churches and the forgotten footnotes of dusty chronicles. And now, as we close the heavy book of this final segment, let your thoughts return to the beginning, to the slow bell in the morning, the cold cell, the dry bread, the aching knees, to Bede in his corner, quietly copying a word, to the lost shelves, the silent libraries, to the robed man who ruled the village and was still called brother. This has been a journey behind the monastery walls where devotion met drudgery, and where silence sometimes echoed with power. Now, as the final candle flickers low, let your mind drift slowly, quietly, back to your own soft bed, far from stone floors and distant bells, and sleep, knowing that even in the coldest places of history, there was always warmth in the search for knowledge.